Good evening, everybody. And welcome to the 5th annual BCPC Year in Review. My name is Omar Dominguez. I am a commissioner with the Vancouver City Planning Commission. And before we go any further, would like to acknowledge that we're in the ancestral, traditional, unceded territories of the Squamish, Musqueam, and the Tsleil-Waututh nations, who have lived on these lands for thousands of years before Europeans arrived here. Would also, at the Planning Commission, like to acknowledge that we are 6 days into Black History Month. And we acknowledge that we all face the challenge of forgetting our own history. And in the case that in our country, this history is founded on land speculation, colonialism, and more than 200 years of slavery that ended, and 30 years before the United States of America wrote the 1863 Emancipation Proclamation. And this proclamation gave the legal basis for free enslaved people of African descent, many of whom subsequently, over years of multiple generations of Black freedom speakers, migrated to Canada, including to the city of Vancouver, and largely within the now displaced Hogan's Alley community. And it's within the context of this acknowledgement of the history of the stolen lands and stolen peoples forced onto this land, and within this context that the Vancouver City Planning Commission, we acknowledge our commitment to ground our work in the understanding of the legacies of the past. And we heed a call not to forget Black history, the contributions of Black members of our nation, province, and our city, and the uncomfortable truths that this recognition creates within all of us today. And we also commit to remember this history not only during the month of February, but until every day that we conduct our work. And part of the conversation today is that knowing our past opens doors to our collective future. So the year in review brings out ideas of what the city should pay attention to as we look to our future, to help Vancouver make choices that guide our evolution and the direction that leads to an inclusive, equitable, and livable city. So that's the context that brings us today. So I'm going to make a few introductions. Please hold your applause to the end. There's a few commissioners in the room. If my fellow commissioners would like to stand up. Thank you. And our executive director, Yuri Aribis. We also have elected officials, Pete Fry, that I've seen, and there's other elected officials in the room today. And also Janet Fraser from the Vancouver School Board. Thank you. And also the volunteers of the Chronology Committee that do amazing work that brings us today. So thank you. So you can applaud now. Thank you. Thank you, Tana. So we're pleased that you are able to join us today. 2019 was a very busy time at City Hall. And even for those that follow the agendas of council, it was challenging to keep up with everything that was going on. And the significant initiative is that the difference between milestones and what is incremental change, which is part of our discussion today. So tonight is an opportunity to turn the spotlight on this watershed moment, and that could change the direction of our city. So we are very excited with the interest that this event always has. And unfortunately, we couldn't accommodate everybody in the list that wanted to be here tonight. But we are streaming this event through SFU Facebook, and we're also recording the event. There will be a link that will be sent to all of the attendees. And will also be posted at the SFU City Program, and which is a supporter of the Chronology program, and also the SFU Community Engagement website. Now, if you have one of this, please make sure that it's on silent mode. If you have one of these also, our hashtag for tonight is Milestones 2019, and the handle for the VCPC is @VCPCBC. There will be no intermission tonight, and also if you do not want to appear in the video, please make sure that you let us know and let Yuri know, and we'll make sure that you're edited out of the video. And now I would like to introduce Councillor Pete Fry, and who is our liaison at the VCPC, and who would like to say a few words of welcome.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Pete Fry. I'm a Vancouver City Councillor, and here with a lot of gratitude on the traditional territories of the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh people. And I would also like to acknowledge Chief Ian Campbell of the Squamish Nation is here with us tonight. Very honored to have your presence here. And I would send greetings from all of Vancouver City Council and the Mayor. And I want to thank all the volunteers who helped make this happen. And not just the volunteers on the VCPC, on the Vancouver Planning Commission, but also the volunteers who helped work on this Milestones project. Because they're not commissioners, they're not paid, they're just really passionate about urban issues here in our city. And as I look around this room, I see a lot of very familiar faces of other passionate Vancouverites who care about planning in our city and the future of our city. And it's great to be here in the room with you all, and it's going to be a really fun evening. Because I know all of our panelists tonight, and I'm really jazzed to be this is going to be a great panel too. So the Year in Review panel discussion is a great opportunity to step back and from the hustle of daily business and look at the bigger picture and hear what perspective some of the top urban thinkers in our city consider the trends in city building and the evolution of the city. So the Year in Review really takes on a special importance this year because this is the year that we've embarked on the new Citywide Vancouver plan. And thinking about significant events of the past is especially valuable when we plan for the future, because of course we need to reflect on the past to plan for the future. Of course, we have the proposed milestones that are here, none of which I would have proposed. I think the biggest milestone for me, of course, is being on council. This is our first year on council, and it's a very diverse council, and how we're making things work is really interesting with no one party and majority. We're finding new channels and paths to make things work and collaborate, and it's a very, very, very different environment than what has been traditionally the tone in Vancouver City Hall since we had an independent mayor with Mike Harcourt. So this is really kind of a new chapter. And I would say also that one of the first things this new council did was introduce a renter's office and really start prioritizing some of the rights of renters and modifications to our TRP, and really working hard to make sure that we're balancing some of those needs with some of the challenges in our city. I'm so many of the milestones that we are going to be talking about tonight are the culmination of years of advocacy and grassroots activism by other citizens like us who care about our city and want to see the future with greater equity and inclusion. These milestones aren't just memories of the past. Those people influence the decisions of city council now, city councils of the past, and will continue to influence city councils as we shift directions in the city. So with that in mind, it's really great to see such a strong turnout. And I want to thank you all for participating in this Year in Review. I also want to thank the panelists once again for participating in this and sharing your really valuable perspective. And looking forward to what you're going to share with us. So thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Pete. And next, I'm going to introduce Marta Fairbank, who will provide a brief overview of tonight's event. And Marta is a fellow of the Canadian Institute of Planners, chair of the Vancouver Heritage Commission, urban planning and principal at PFS Studio, and of landscape architecture, and a former chair of the Planning Commission. Thank you, Marta.
Thank you. So I'm here tonight as a volunteer on the Planning Commission's Chronology Committee. It's a really interesting group that's come together because we really care about the chronology and making sure that people understand what happened in the past so that we can look forward to the future. The Chronology Committee started in a meeting in 2014 where the VCPC commissioners invited all the past commissioners who were still around to come and have a conversation about what the VCPC should be doing. And in that conversation, it was identified that there was really no good record of what had happened in planning, so they set out to create a chronology. And the idea was not to have a history of planning, but to really point out the moments in time where significant events happened that changed the course of the development of the city. So with the assistance of an advisory group of urbanists and a class at the University of British Columbia, a first draft of the chronology was put together. This is the 5th year that we've had a year in review event. So this is really a process that we've evolved to create an opportunity for the community to come together and inform us as the committee about what happened each year that was significant. And one of the first things that we've identified, and I think there's been a mention of that already tonight, is the fact that past chronologies have always started with the colonial settlement of Vancouver. And we're hoping to expand the chronology to be more inclusive through the reconciliation process. And we're working with the advisory panel and other Indigenous volunteers to try to do that. We also recognize the need to include cultural communities who are part of the history of Vancouver more directly in the process. So Chinese Canadian, Indo-Canadian, Black communities, we're looking ways to bring volunteers to support the chronology for that. So the process for developing the list that is now in front of you and is on the panels in the back of the room is a workshop which takes a brainstorm shortlist from the committee and workshops it with people who are interested. Then we invite a panel, and we have a wonderful panel tonight, to come and, given that information, to share with us how they feel about the year that's passed. And we will then use this information to update the online chronology. It will also be part of one of the VCPC's reports to council to update them on what the public at large feels has been significant about the year 2019. We always put things on the chronology as emerging because it takes a while to know whether something was really important or not. So after 5 years pass, we do a review, and we've just reviewed 2014 to see whether the milestones really were significant or whether they are really inconsequential after 5 years have passed. So if you're interested, you can look on the chronology and see what was adopted for 2014. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our moderator, Johal, who will lead the panel through the discussion tonight. Am is Director of Community Engagement at SFU's Vancity Office of Community Engagement within this facility, the SFU Woodward's Cultural Unit. Previously, Johal worked with the Vancouver Agreement, and this was an effort to address economic and social development in the city. He was co-founder of UBC's Humanities 101 program and chair of the Impact on Communities Coalition. He has also been an advisor to 2 provincial cabinet ministers, Transportation and Highways, and Community Development Cooperatives and Volunteers, and was also a member of the Vancouver City Planning Commission for 2 terms from 2012 to 2015. So, Anne.
Thank you very much, Marta. Thank you for being here tonight. I was just moderating a discussion at the Orpheum the other night put on by the City of Vancouver around the climate emergency, and it's great that people come out for discussions like this to talk about the future of the city. My job tonight is to keep us focused on the big questions that the Vancouver City Planning Commission have put before us, which is what are the defining decisions, actions, and events in planning and development in 2019 that could prove to be transformative in how Vancouver evolves. In terms of the format of the evening, I'll introduce the panelists. They'll each speak for 4 to 5 minutes each, and we'll have a discussion amongst the panelists, and we'll open it up for questions from the audience. The panelist tonight, Stephanie Allen. She's an Associate Vice President for Strategic Business Operations and Performance at BC Housing, a Director at Hogan's Alley Society, formerly with Catalyst Community Development Society, working on the delivery of affordable housing projects, and also worked with a privately owned company on an assisted living development. Please join me in welcoming Stephanie Allen. You can bring her up, yeah. Next is Sarah Blythe, is Executive Director of the Overdose Prevention Society, mental health worker with the Portland Hotel Society, former chair of the Vancouver Park Board. Please welcome Sarah. Chief Ian Campbell is a hereditary chief in the Squamish Nation, has been elected twice to the Squamish Nation Council. He's an SFU alumni, graduated with an MBA, helped bring together a collaboration between the Musqueam, Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh to agree to work together to develop the Jericho lands on the west side of Vancouver, the former RCMP land in central Vancouver, and the current BC liquor distribution plant in East Vancouver. Please welcome Chief Ian Campbell. And Ray Spaxman is an architect and planner with over 50 years of experience. He's a former municipal planner in England, Toronto, and Vancouver, where he was director of planning from 1973 to 1989, and currently he's president of RSC Limited, providing planning and urban design advice in Canada and internationally. Please join us, Ray.
I think we're going to just jump right into it, and maybe we'll start with Stephanie with some of your thoughts. So.
Sure. So I guess I looked at the list and I saw a lot of really, outstanding points that will shape the city moving forward, and I guess we'll dig into maybe some of those specifics. I want to acknowledge, that as a descendant of enslaved people on this hemisphere, we are on unceded lands across this continent, here in Vancouver on the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh. And in Black History Month, we really do acknowledge how much our history is tied up with the colonization of this continent, as well as the colonization of our home continent of Africa. So, it's, I come into this work and city building, and through my research, I've looked a lot at the Vancouver Town Planning Commission's history and what it did and who it represented and who was definitely not at the table. And you didn't see women, you didn't see Indigenous people, you didn't see people of color, and our city has been built up around that. And we live with that legacy to this day. And I was recently actually just in the Vancouver archives on Monday looking for some files for an article I'm writing. And I saw some quotes actually in one of the Town Planning Commission files. It talked about a place called Hogan's Alley, and this was the quote. It's hovels unfit for human habitation, and that immediate steps be taken to utterly destroy and eliminate these breeding places of crime, disease, and filth. Such extreme language, right, when we think about it, and it leads me to think about where we are on, housing itself as a crisis. So housing was a crisis then, it continues to be a crisis in this city. And so a milestone for me that stands out in 2019 was this wrap up in Vancouver of the rapid response to homelessness, the temporary modular buildings that went up, and what that has meant about the powers of planning to move into communities to identify the needs for housing for homeless people and to get those things done. Still respectfully bringing community into process, but doing so that really showed that we're reacting to a crisis, so I thought that was pretty important. I think another thing that I saw as an important policy move as we see the city move towards more equitable policies in city building, I'm thrilled to see that. I'm thrilled to see that direction. But then I see also things like the plastic straw ban and how that impacted people with disabilities in this city. So I think when we see moves that are really pivotal, it can't just benefit the majority. It really has to include people who are considered minorities or at the margins. And then I also think about the the townhome development on South Granville that wasn't approved for development, and what that means in a city that is so struggling to build housing supply across the continuum. I live in housing right now. I live in a rental that probably at my income I should leave and free that space up for other folks, but I can't find any place to live in my neighborhood, and I can't find places that are secured rental where I feel like I can, have that security of tenure. So when we see these kinds of things in a housing crisis, I think we've got to really be mindful about how such decisions are going to impact the future of our city. So I'll leave it there. Those are some of my thoughts.
Great. Thank you.
I guess it's me next. All right. You've introduced me, so I guess I'll start by saying it's a bit of a shock for me today because I'm, mostly in the middle of a crisis in the downtown east side, dealing with people who are, at their basic wits' end. People are dying, and it's just a really terrible time, and I feel, and I'm really thankful to be part of this conversation. And when I was on Park Board, planning was one of my favorite parts of being on Park Board, planning for the future, planning for young people, planning for, working with planners to come up with a great city for people to live in. And I'm really, really looking forward to this discussion. I wanted to just agree with Councillor Fry. I'm really optimistic about the City Council. I really feel like they're listening to people, and the meeting's taken an awfully long time, but I really feel like that they're listening and really trying to serve the city in a positive way. So I'm really looking forward to discussing all of these things and I'm really thankful to be here tonight. So thanks for inviting me. It's a bit of a really stressful time for me. I'm kind of at my wit's end on a lot of ways, but this is great. So thanks.
Yeah, hi everybody. Neitla and Khalq. So my ancestral name is Khalq, and my lineage comes from the Chatsalano family, who you'll know as Kitsilano. I come from the Úxwumixw family on my dad's side, the Squamish family on my mom's side. I was saying to the group when we met earlier, I love this city, but it hasn't always loved me or my family. We were forcibly removed from our villages in what is now Vancouver over 100 years ago in 1913. But we're back, and we've always been here. And our history is your history. Most of you probably don't know the breadth of our mythology, of our place names, of our history that spans millennia. And it's time to share that. It's, Canada attempted to eradicate that knowledge and that history. And it's hard for me to zero in specifically on 2019, although we have done a lot of work, as you see on the panels, with False Creek lands, our village of Snork, the reclamation of that land in 2003 after litigating in 1977. We move in decades, and we did a referendum amongst the Squamish Nation to determine what direction our people would like to see those lands being utilized. And overwhelmingly, they wanted to see us be a part of the solution for affordability, for rental units, and start to address that we're in this together. To move beyond blame, shame, and judgment is important for us to reconcile. So I thank you for the recognition of the shared territories. It's important. It doesn't just start with Narvaez in our waters in the late 1700s or Vancouver showing up in 1792. It spans well beyond that. So it's time to celebrate that and move forward and mature as a society collectively. So I'm happy to be here. Served 4 terms now on Squamish Council, 20 years in politics. I call it recreational suffering. We do this for fun, but it's to affect positive change. We're simply relay runners. I accept the baton from my predecessors, many of my elders who are now passed on, who were my mentors. And I want to honor that legacy by doing the best we can, ultimately to pass that on to the next generation to create space for them. So happy to be here. Thank you.
Ray.
Okay, that's a good lot to follow. I got to tell you, though, that I came thinking I got to talk about the 5 milestones. So I'm going to have to shift suddenly from that because I think the theme has changed. So we may talk about that a bit later on, but not now. I wanted to say, first of all, how pleased I am to be here. One of the reasons for that is that when I first arrived here as Director of Planning in 1975, one of the great supporters of planning was the VCPC. And here they are still doing hard work as volunteers, trying to bring a citizen's point of view to the efforts that are going on. In my day, I consider them my friends, and they were my friends. I considered the UDI was my friend too, and the building trades and everybody else in organizations. So we had a friendly attitude about planning. And if I have a concern today, it's that that friendly attitude has been disrupted by a whole series of events, not the least of which everybody seems to be too busy. The poor old councillors, how on earth they handle all the paper that they have to deal with is phenomenal. So one has to congratulate them for what they do, you know, particularly with the nice attitude that so many of them have when they come to these meetings. The other reason for why I'm pleased to be here is I was reminded of when I came that I've just achieved a goal that I didn't know I would achieve. And so what the goal was, I was at a conference about 30 years ago, and an older man on the stage stood up and he said, and that's why I'm pleased to be here tonight, I'm pleased to be anywhere. So I really am pleased to be anywhere. And I know as a consequence of saying how old I am, you'll forgive me for all the mistakes I made this evening. On the various milestones, as they're called, it occurred to me that Rain City Strategies Climate Emergency, with all their 200 pages of detailed information, was hard to actually grasp. But I like the idea where they were going, and it does seem to relate to this bigger milestone that we can all see ahead of us and not doing very much about, which is the milestone created by climate change. And these things sort of tackle bits of it, but not all of it. So I'm looking forward to the Citywide plan, which is profoundly important to this city, in my judgment. And that's because we all have to think about what might it be. So the current process of planning, I don't think is very good. The current process is go out and ask everybody what they'd like to see. I've been to some of those conferences, and people sit around a table struggling to find out what they think when they haven't actually had any work beforehand except their own personal lives. Their personal ability to affect planning is profoundly important, and so conversations are important. But also important is, what are the experts saying? What are the opportunities that appear to be available to us? I would like to see, as a startup of any planning process, the people who are supposed to know say, this is what we think we know, then we can tackle them and tell them how wrong they are. But for example, if you think of the several alternatives that are available in this city, from complete disaster to a wonderful solution with an improbable position that we're all aware of, is that milestone that appears, is it when we reach 2 degrees higher, 1 degree higher, 3 degrees higher, and all the refugee circumstances that are happening. I don't think we're tackling that, and that's because we're overwhelmed with the housing situation. The housing situation is also something we're dealing with on the basis of old-fashioned ideas of what economy means. So the economy and the GDP and the absence of consideration of the earth as a valuable place, like we have to make it work for us. We don't have to destroy it and take everything from it so it no longer can survive. And there's going to be radical shifts as a consequence in our work. And so the work we do in planning has to be aware of all those future alternatives and take them all seriously in the work we do. The 2 hostel purchases were seen to be very relevant, particularly as it's taken us about 20 years to come to the idea that we have to intervene and not just let bad landlords go on doing the things they're doing because capitalism suggests that's the right way to behave. So that's an important milestone, small one, but probably be very important to us. The arts and culture plan, I read some of it and I couldn't quite get all of it. And so I thought, well, that must be pretty good because we're all for arts and culture. But in the terms of the milestone I see ahead, I was a bit puzzled about why I would think that would be a major milestone. That's because perhaps I need to be more aware of what artists are doing for us, and I know I'm not aware enough of that. And then the final one, of course, is where we could have a lot of fun tonight, is the Squamish Snork proposal. And I'll read you out what I wrote to begin that piece of the discussion. I guess I became suddenly aware in this some 4 months ago. And it was a sudden shock. I looked at the newspaper when I opened the newspapers and was confronted with a photograph of a pile of extraordinarily green-clad, very thick and very tall high-rises surrounding the south end of the Burrard Bridge. And I thought, my God, that density must be twice any density we've ever had there. Can we handle it? How do they keep all those plants alive, all greening everything up? Why are they so fat? Why are they so close together? Why are they squashed up against the Burrard Bridge? And I thought, no, relax, Ray, because there's an important other story about this, and that was this land, acres and 45, 50 acres of land, were taken from the indigenous peoples way back in the early part of the century in very unseemly fashion by the colonists. By the way, I'm an immigrant from England, as you may be able to tell from my strange accent. But nevertheless, having gone through that process, I tried to find out what was going on. I couldn't. So everybody's clammed up. For some reason, the press gets hold of stories, but I haven't heard anything profound like you get with a rezoning application normally in town. I know this isn't a rezoning application because I'm also afraid to hear the mayor say, it's a gift to us. And part of the gift is that they no longer need to take any notice of the bylaws, the urban design guidelines, the studies we've done over countless years to find the way to guide development so it's humane, human, and worth living in. To squish 6,000 apartment units on that site at those densities when all around it there are other areas which should be brought into play, so there's a comprehensive plan, is a ridiculous place to be at this time. Now, what I'm assuming is that it's so quiet in the upper echelons of the proponents and the governments that they're all working it out already, and I should just relax. But I know from the reaction I get from my conversations on this area that there are hundreds of thousands or hundreds of people around this city who are very concerned. Do they mean that? Does the press really mean they're so pleased that this group will be able to do whatever they like on that lands? I don't believe that because I respect very much what the First Nations are doing these days, which is talking about what they bring to the table. And they don't bring to the table the materialistic impact of trying to increase the densities beyond what they were before and making billions of dollars in screwing the land up, as seems to be the case. So they're negotiating, and all those negotiations go on out of the public eye, and yet somehow we have a responsibility to be involved with them. So before I get out of line, as the chairman's beginning to tell me,
we need to have a conversation.
Yeah. So we'll be able to have the conversation any minute now.
Okay, thank you. I was going to jump in there, and you all mentioned a number of different things, but I think I just read a thing that the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives put out around the opportunities with the Snork development and also with MST development around the possibility of density and affordability that those projects will bring forward as a kind of opportunity for the city in a way that the City of Vancouver hasn't been able to do on its own. So I think partly if some of you could speak to the possibilities of what that development does, given that it doesn't fall under City of Vancouver bylaws and processes, that actually creates a certain type of opportunity perhaps. And also housing, of course, is still an issue here. And whether developments like that or the possibilities of Hogan's Alley, the kinds of conversations you've been trying to elevate at the city, where in the processes they get stuck or left off. Wondering if you can speak to that. And I guess the third piece I would throw out there is, of course, the citywide planning process. Many people have discussed it and put it forward. And this thing that Councillor Fry talked about, we are in a context of a pizza parliament, as the Italians would say, when there isn't a majority in place. And so what are the possibilities, or what's the reading of this council's decisions in the first year, and what are the kind of possibilities we can maybe look to with this council going forward as well? Why don't we start with you, Chief?
Sure. So the simple answer is resistance is futile. You will be assimilated. No. How do you like us now?
I'm looking forward to it.
No, it's a very important issue, and we have to have fun. Reconciliation means you put the silly back in reconciliation as well, and it also entails reconciliation. So, Snork is definitely an important village of ours. It's always been prime real estate for thousands of years. Our economy was very solid up and down the coast around the Salish Sea. And that has been taken away under the Indian Act and continues to be when you look at Wet'suwet'en title. We had to acquire these lands through court cases where we weren't afforded legal recourse prior to the 1960s. So post-1960, we became very active to challenge the honor of the Crown in how they imposed legislative oppression through forcible removement from what is now Vancouver. I like framing things. When I look at the board in the back and it says, the Squamish don't need to adhere to any city planning or strategies, you need to look at that through a different lens. And the city doesn't have to adhere to any Squamish Nation strategies or visions or history or values and principles. And that's been the modus operandi from day one upon settler arrival to this part of the world. Where the attitude towards Indigenous people was very, very negative. I've traveled all over the world, and many people don't see me as Indigenous. They don't see me as Native. It's not until you do the and then they say, oh, you're Indian. So many people still have a preconceived image where I say we're invisible in our own land, because I would challenge anyone here to name 3 traditional place names in our language. Everything is in English. English Bay, Howe Street, Simon Fraser, all of these institutes, all of this colonial history continues to marginalize Indigenous people. So we need action. And when we say we want to step forward to seek justice, it took decades of effort to acquire 11 acres of land, 10.68 to be accurate. But we also have 120 acres of MST land. So I was one of the negotiators for the Musqueam Squamish Tsleil-Waututh to acquire 120 acres in Vancouver of fee simple lands. Those lands are not reserve. We're not interested in additions to reserve or the treaty process. We want to use those lands as economic drivers. We still face the reality of abject poverty, where the average Indigenous person that you see on our streets in Vancouver is overrepresented. I really commend Sarah and the work she's doing around affecting change with addictions, and I want to be a part of that solution. With opioid crisis, those are my relatives, those are your relatives, those are our community members. It's not us and them, it's us. So when we start to develop Snork, you have seen renderings and iterations. We've done transparent processes through Ernst & Young to RFP and solicit interest from developers, because we can't do it alone. We're new entrants in the market in a sea of thousands of developments in our territory that were imposed without our consent and without compensation. Now that we're new entrants in the market, we want to be a part of the solution, and we can't do it alone. We need to look to the city for servicing. We need to look to other levels of government. We're still under the Indian Act when it comes to those lands and how their development. We need the great white fathers to the east, the paternalism of Ottawa, to still dictate to First Nations how we can develop those lands. So it's not free and clear for us to do whatever we want, but hopefully someday we will be able to merge those processes to incorporate Indigenous law, Indigenous science. TMX was just approved for the second time this week, and we've been at the forefront of that challenge to say, is this the right strategy and vision for this part of the world? There's many issues that tie into this city planning. We're not in isolation as Vancouver. We're moving into a post-colonial era, and we ask ourselves, what does that look like? What are the actions that go with reconciliation? So I'm happy to elaborate on that in any aspect. Thank you.
I couldn't have said it better, and I just want to echo what you're saying. But in terms of, if First Nations can build us housing and avoid some bureaucracy, bureaucracy is the thing that keeps us from having enough housing in the city, and anything to build more housing for people. There's so many people suffering. I see homeless people, hundreds of them all day, every day, with all kinds of terrible stories. And so many people are, can't move from house to house, and even in their apartments, because there's just not enough places for them to live. So, density is something that it's so hard to get in the city because there's always some list of reasons why not to do it. So I'm all for density in housing.
Yeah, I think it's important to pause on some of the phrasing, right, of humane and civilized and things that really are, stand-ins for colonial ideology and Eurocentric thinking. And we've lived with that for a long time, and what it's done is it's excluded a lot of people from full participation, not only in things like planning, but in the economy, in social and civil society, in the political realm. And so there's a lot more language and people are getting more comfortable talking about colonialism, but I don't think we're really, we're just scratching the surface right now to understand what it has meant about the built form of the city, what it's meant about how we order cities, and the erasure of such brilliant indigenous wisdom from around this world about how cities were built. The greatest building that was ever built is in Africa, the pyramids. We have such wisdom that's been eradicated and destroyed through the process of resource extraction and wealth accumulation in a colonial system. And so if we're really interested in cities that are for everyone, then we're going to really embrace and move into that discomfort of questioning how things have been ordered for so long. The Hogan's Alley proposal, I wish I was here 2 years ago to vote on that policy that passed for the Northeast Falls Creek Plan, because that was the first time a city plan had a chapter on reconciliation, acknowledging Indigenous communities, Chinatown, and the Black community that were impacted when that area of town was developed. So I think that as we all grapple with that discomfort, I've been at many presentations in this city where people come up to me afterwards to talk to me about something I've said that might have been triggering, and I just want to say it's okay. We can do this together. We can forge ahead together. It's always better when we do that type of when we approach things that way and problem solving that way, and the exclusions of the past are just no longer benefiting us.
I was just going to add just around some pieces related to the Arts and Culture Plan that passed. Councillor Fry is the liaison with the Arts and Culture Committee, and there was a big part of that 10-year plan that included equity, diversity, inclusion, that included the support of Indigenous organization as well. And part of the analysis around that was, although we had a thriving arts and culture sector that was under threat, the funding around it didn't reflect the diversity of the city. So beyond housing, it seems to be across the planning sector of the city. We have some of these issues that I think hopefully will be addressed as part of the citywide planning process. I'm wondering if any of you have anything to say around the arts and culture plan or any of the transportation decisions that were made. Certainly, historically in the city, we've had the RAV line, which led to a certain type of development along Cambie and the kinds of things to mitigate against the types of speculation or the types of development we could see along Broadway and other parts of the city.
I'm a bit nonplussed because I wanted to have a say in my turn here about the Snork thing. But if I can do that gently, I'd like to do that. So, okay. So the point I'm trying to make is that not that we should let it go because there's been a history of bad things going on. All of us have learned a lot in this last 100, 200, 300 years. We're no longer the people of 200 years ago, although some components of what we have as a society, as we can see from what's happening to the south of us, are not particularly enjoyable parts of our nature. What I'm concerned about is in relation to the Snork development. Here we have 11 acres consisting of twisted railway lines. There's 3 of them coming together in one place under a major arterial, which is not the place you choose if you wanted to put some high-density housing. You might choose a part which included Vanier Park and the vacant lands to the south of what is now known by the Snork, in order to do a decent scheme. That scheme will require some bureaucratic work, so it won't be the bureaucrats who actually do that will be holding things up. It'll be the bureaucrats who are trying to do the planning under the guidance of the council, who are giving them good guidance, that will do it. So we need those bureaucrats. Maybe the private sector can do it, but there will still be people who will be accused of holding things up because they take too long. And too long also comes from what councillors lead and do. And so you're finding that there's a confusion right now in the debate that's going on about Snork, presumably in private, because it's not handling in public as far as I can tell, except for newspaper articles about it. So I just hope that the Indigenous peoples and the people who've come here after that can get on and work out a plan which is good for everybody. And I think it would be better for the Indigenous peoples if they were able to do that.
Yeah, so I think on the cultural plan, what I think has been so exciting about where we're moving to as a city is we're acknowledging how cultural infrastructure is being lost in the city, the affordable spaces, and that to weave equity into the guiding principles of it, acknowledging anti-Black racism, acknowledging Indigenous history and present contemporary communities. I, as Hogan's Alley Society, participated in one of the Host Your Own Engagement programs over the summer, and it was challenging for a small organization to really deliver something on such a small budget, and we learned a lot from that, even though it was a great move for the city to fund organizations like us for that. I think when we think about some of the broader strokes of building an equitable city that has accessible cultural amenities, it's about also thinking about delivering infrastructure for some of these marginalized groups to build their capacity. I think we saw how that was a challenge for us to fit into these programs, and our feedback to that was about making sure that these cultural plans acknowledge where groups need to be brought in a more inclusive way, even in the planning process, so that those capacities aren't challenged or decimated in some of these really well-intentioned programs.
Yeah, I had the great fortune of working on the Sea to Sky Highway upgrade and putting in visible presence through the naming and recognition with our language. We're immediately showcased to the world that it's not French, it's not English, therefore it must be an Indigenous language. People can't read it or understand it. It's like we ate a lot of salmon and we had a fish bone stuck because it's like the language has a lot of guttural sounds that are very hard for a lot of anglicized speakers to say. But it immediately transformed the corridor, and that's a part of our connection here on the West Coast. Who and what we're attracting to this part of the world is substantive in a global context. So the art, the visible presence is starting to showcase that it's synonymous with West Coast, and we want to see that reflected in many different aspects of our culture, not just at YVR upon arrival or departure from this great city, but building it into building designs, into streets, into real planning processes that celebrate where we are in this part of the world, and start looking at revitalization of rewatering of streams. We had so much salmon in this city at one point. We had so much herring coming back to our waters this time of year. The frogs would start singing in February when they come out of hibernation. We don't hear those things anymore. We're so far removed from that as urbanites, and that's a huge loss to all of us. So looking at nature and art and reflection on that is important. In saying that, transportation is part of that equation, part of the affordability, and some of our lands with the MST lands in Jericho, 90 acres of contiguous lands, some of the most best lands in the world, definitely in North America, as we move forward and develop that, and start to connect the linkages of transportation and affordability of housing and daycare and jobs, industrial lands. All of these portfolios are very important to see the synergy that we're not just doing things in isolation, but they matter and they make a difference. So we want to see the rapid transit all the way to UBC and utilize our Jericho lands as part of that hub, part of the appropriate density that could be contemplated in certain parts of our land portfolio. So we look at things not only from Vancouver, but our land holdings are on the Sunshine Coast, the Sea to Sky Corridor, Whistler. We have a large territory that we must manage and be cognizant of and interface with many levels of government concurrently. So I think that's a very important question that you raise, and we certainly value these opportunities to sit face to face.
Sir?
Yeah. when I was on park board, we looked at a lot of the old streams that existed in Vancouver before we developed Vancouver, and bringing a lot of that back would be amazing thing to look at when we're planning for our future and planning transportation and planning the city. As far as art is in culture in the city, I worked on a project personally this year where we transformed an alley in the downtown east side we didn't ask, we just did it, we fundraised our own money. I'm definitely a proponent of just do it if you want to do it, and then talk to the planners, and usually if you've got a pretty good idea, everyone will come on board. But anyways, the way that art affected that one alley in the city, and we had a wide range of people painting, taking part in making it a beautiful alley. It just, you could see it built so much love and kindness, and art and culture, throughout the city. It builds what the city is. It makes people feel good. I've been a part of lots of projects in the past that brought art to the city, controversial art and every kind. It gets people moving, and I think that every plan going forward should have a big art focus.
Before I open it up to the audience for questions, I was going to give you each 2 minutes just to maybe talk about what you're most excited about in terms of planning in the city of Vancouver over the next 5 years. What would you like to see happen over the next 5 years? I'll start with Stephanie.
Okay. We didn't talk too much about the climate emergency, and I'm thrilled to see our city move in a direction to really grab some leadership and move forward. And I want us to think as a city about how other decisions impact climate. Some of the more clean employers we think of are doing bad things in other parts of the world, or paying lobby companies to convince the United States government to leave the Paris Agreement, which was reported that I think it was Google that did that. It was a report in The Guardian. So we've got to think about how not only are the things that are happening within our local region, but how they're impacting communities across this world, especially those that are in underdeveloped nations or nations that have high levels of economic exclusion. There are organizations that transport their toxic waste so that they're not polluting places with more powerful political voices, but impacting people in other areas. So we've got to prepare for the fact that there are going to be people on the move from impacted regions who don't have access to the types of climate measures or the infrastructure to help. Are we going to be a welcoming city as well for those folks that are coming here? And how are we thinking about how the poorest and the most marginalized in our own city are going to be hit with the climate crisis, because they may not have the means to move, they may not have the means to find other housing. So really wrapping up the climate picture in looking at that. And I'm really excited, I guess, because I work in affordable housing, to really see us continue to move and respond like this is a crisis. We don't always see decisions that reflect that we're in a crisis, that we don't have enough affordable homes for people to live in, and we're seeing not only people that are homeless on the streets now, but there is a pipeline of homelessness happening because people are continuing to be squeezed out of economic inclusion and opportunity in our region. And it's just so devastating when we see what's happening on our streets and in Oppenheimer Park and other places. These are our family members, these are our communities, and how are we helping them? 60% of young people who are pushed out of foster care end up homeless. this is an incredible statistic, and it requires governments and our city to move and be responsive to that. So, I think, I'm thrilled, to be a part of Hogan's Alley Society. The work that we're trying to do is a proposal for rental housing. Everybody loves to talk about the Vienna model in this city. We are coming forward with a proposal where city-owned lands would be kept in community hands, where all of the housing would be rental, and where the majority would be below market rental with community and nonprofit spaces. So I'm looking forward to how the city will respond to our proposal. It's been a couple of years since we've heard back from our proposal, and we're hopeful that we can move in a direction this year. We've brought together some outstanding partnerships. We have support from the federal government, from local nonprofits, from industry, and we're thrilled to be able to move in that direction. And I'm also really thrilled to see what's happening at Senac. I mean, I joked with Hasalem, who's on the Squamish Council, that it looks like Wakanda when you see the movie Black Panther, because it's this amazing balance of moving in and adopting, denser forms of housing while really respecting the ecology around it. So I think those are the things that really excite me. I'm excited to see more people play a role in our city that haven't in the past.
Great. Thank you, Stephanie.
I'm in the middle of a crisis, so it's really hard for me to get excited unless I see something that's, actively changing the situation that I'm, in with a large group of citizens every day. I think we're in such a, the national housing strategy is really important. It's so important that all levels of government find a way to work together to get people housing and off the streets. It is such a shame, the people that are homeless in the city, First Nations people, people in wheelchairs, people with disabilities, people that are sick, mental health issues. It's everyone that we would be, in shock and ashamed of if we really, really knew what was happening. We need to get folks into some decent housing. Tonight, a bunch of people are going to go sleep out in the snow and rain and yucky, and they do every night. And I see them every day, and I see, where they're coming from, and I hear their stories, and it's so incredibly challenging. And so, I'm thankful, that we've got a good city council, and I'm thankful that we have progressive levels of government, and I'm really hopeful, and I try to continue to be hopeful, and that something's going to happen that will make some changes. So, and I'm looking at these plans, and I'm hopeful, and I'm thankful that the commission is here and doing good work. So, if I can do anything, is just say, let's keep going. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I remain a cockeyed optimist. Incremental change. It takes time, and it takes our collective commitment to move forward, and tenacity and resilience. I look to my grandmother, who's 90 years old, and we have 5 generations in our family with our little ones, and we're fortunate that we have that continuity of her recollection of the blatant racism that she was subjected to. She represents 1920 to 2020, in decades. It's significant to see how far we've come and how far we need to go. I can't take credit for the work we've done around Snork or MST. I'm simply stepping in at a time where I have responsibilities bestowed upon me. So I truly do feel like a relay runner. I simply accept that baton, do the best I can while I have these responsibilities, ultimately to pass that on to the next generation. And everything that we do when we're negotiating, whether it was forestry or ski hill development, 2010 Winter Olympics, we're celebrating the 10-year anniversary this year, we always ask ourselves, why are we doing this if it isn't to create space for young people to flourish? Abject poverty, we don't want to be managing welfare. We want to be managing wealth. And that's not just monetary value. It's wealth as a community. It's wealth as each and every one of us deeply care for each other and we look after each other. We seem to have lost that somehow, where we don't know our neighbors. And we need to bring that back, that we're in it together. We're in the same canoe. You all have a paddle. You all must utilize your paddle, put it in the water, and help us move forward. And the Creator will throw curveballs at us. We will have rainy, stormy days out in the water and other days where the water's calm and flat. And we need to have the fortitude to be able to continue our collective resilience to move our canoe forward. And that's what I see in our young people. We're 60% youth in First Nations across this country, and we're no different as Squamish Nation. And it's those young people who are hungry. They're not assimilated. They're adapting to an ever-changing environment. We will never assimilate. That was the guise of Canada to try and assimilate us through residential schools. I'm the first generation out of residential schools in my family. It's not about assimilation. That was never the modus operandi of Canada. It was about eradication of our language and culture to clear the land for settlers and newcomers to come in and create affluence. And we've seen that gold rush mentality over and over and over again over the last 200 years. And it's time to mature. It's time to move forward as a society. And that's what I see these boards, these opportunities. It's okay to be uncomfortable, to get through that. It's okay to go through the fire to get to the other side. And that's what I see. 2020 is vision. It's clarity. Let's do it together. Thank you.
Okay. What I see is a continual effort over many years, all the years I've been here. There's been a growing affordability problem. There's been a growing housing problem, and it continues. And I think all the efforts being made at the present time are helpful, but they're failing in one area, which is the citywide plan. So from my point of view, if we have to do the citywide plan, it's so important, but it's so important, it's also very exciting. And yet it doesn't get carried out with the excitement that it deserves, which is, what are the alternatives? How are we going to face the enormous problems way beyond the local ones of housing at the present time? How can we find a place that we must go in order to reach a solution to the climate change problems and all the economic problems and social problems that accompany that? We need a broader understanding of how some of the major elements of the way we work, like the economy and even the way that we prepare bylaws and plans, have to be revised. And that's something hopefully will happen. But I think it's a pity that we've had a year now of doing the citywide plan, and I don't feel any excitement anywhere about it. I don't see anything happening. If I was the Director of Planning today, I know you don't want that to happen, but if I was the Director of Planning today, I'd really want to take a personal hand in writing a memo every month to everybody to say, hey, we are doing a citywide plan, and isn't it exciting? See this, see that opportunity. We've got to face these issues. They're bigger than the ones we have at the present time. Now, all those things that go on at the present time have to go on. All the housing efforts are important. All the planning efforts are important too. So the Globe and Mail was wrong in November, whenever it was, when it had a headline to advise all Canadians. Vancouver doesn't need more planning, it needs housing. And I thought, my God, what is coming to? So anyway, I'm very hopeful and positive in the long time I've got ahead of me to watch this happen. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, I hope that was enough material for you to jump in with questions. I'm just going to ask that you state your name and make sure your question is a question. We'll take 3 questions in a row, get the panel to respond. We're going to end at around 8:40, and I'm going to give the panelists opportunities to respond. Chief Ian Campbell has to be at a family event, so I'm going to make sure that he's able to respond first before he has to go, but I'm committed to making sure that you get to your family gathering. So there's some volunteers that have microphones, I think. If you could just put your hand up. There's one back there. Question? There.
My name's Allison, and I just really enjoyed the panel, so thank you so much, everybody, for the ideas you put out there. And I want to build off the last point that Ray has made about asking the question of, it seems like people aren't that excited about city plan, if I take your comment, that something that should be so exciting and that's coming should gather a lot of intrigue and interest. And then I noticed that some of the most interesting things of 2019 that have captured our imagination are the Snork development, are the work of Hogan's Alley Society, culture shift, a huge burgeoning discussion about equity and what it means to decolonize our work. So I just wonder, is that the connection? Because I would agree. I don't think people are particularly excited yet about city plan. And so I wonder, are there ways panelists could think of that we could decolonize city plan, reverse the experts, and put other experts with different knowledge in charge and some ideas about that? I'd be interested. How do we breathe life into city plan in the next year?
Wait, there's a question out front here. Does someone have a microphone? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, it's Ian. You're heading out, so I would just ask you this question. Can you tell me your relationship with Concord in the past? You did the Porto Cove. You were planning on that development, and the relationship with Concord walking back to right here.
Thank you.
Walking back to, I think it was what, 2010 around there, and 8 approximately. Why would you then partner with West Bank on the deal under the bridge, the MST deal there?
We'll just wait till the one more question in the back there. Yeah.
Okay. Richard Evans, I'm chair of the Falls Creek Replan Committee of the Falls Creek South Neighborhood Association. And I think my question has to do with what role do neighborhoods have in planning forward in the context of the city plan? We've found ourselves in a situation where we have council motion dating back to 2012, George Affleck putting forward a motion to get on with the work of taking our part of town into the future in an integrated kind of way based on principles. And in the space of that, we've formed a basically community advocacy towards doing it, picking up our pencils and basically doing it ourselves. And it's getting away from the top-down bureaucracy, but it's kind of a ground-up sort of thing. So I think my question is for Ray in terms of what role do neighborhoods play in the city plan process so that we can get basically effective in the advocacy and answering a lot of the concerns that are coming up about equity and reconciliation, all these things that are so important to us.
Did any of you want to jump in and respond to any of those questions?
Yeah, thank you for the question regarding Concord Pacific, or was Concord Pacific at the time. Terry Hoy is the proponent for, well, the owner of Concord. And you inquired about the Porto lands, 1,200 acres that became available through the BC Rail surplus lands. They were going to sell these lands. The nation stepped in, Squamish Nation, and had the opportunity to acquire these lands. We didn't have access to capital back then. This was burgeoning around 2000 and post-2000 with court cases and a lot of consultation requirements, court rulings and whatnot. So we looked to the market. We looked to Terry Hui to partner with us and acquire the lands. The opportunity was for additions to reserve in Porto. We then went to SLRD, Squamish Regional District, to rezone. There was a lot of challenges. The 2008 recession hit. We didn't go to pre-sales on those lands to raise the capital to put the roads and infrastructure in. So the project is basically stalled. The nation couldn't carry the costs. So we basically transferred our right to 1,200 acres of additions to reserve out of the Sea to Sky Highway upgrade deal, where we negotiated other land acquisitions in Squamish, where we're currently in the additions to reserve process. I like to say that process is glacial, but now the glaciers are melting faster than they used to, so it's a very slow molasses, if you will, burdensome process. But those lands in Squamish are intended for future communities, so we need the MST lands to stimulate revenues and ongoing opportunities for us to then reinvest into our community lands. We're currently 4,000 members as a Squamish Nation. 60% youth means we're going to double in the next 15, 20 years. We need to find adequate housing for our own relatives as well. So a lot of them have expressed interest to live in the Squamish Valley, and that's why we're utilizing the Porto lands as leverage, the Sea to Sky Highway, the Olympics, all of those synergies to then identify other lands. The portfolio of lands, of developable lands in our territory is very limited when it comes to outside of a 200-year floodplain or torrent hazard. If you look at our reserves, just a quick fact, our reserves comprise 0.3% of our territory that was allocated to us by the federal government. So we can't sustain ourselves on that pittance of land for perpetuity, hence a need to acquire new lands. To answer the first question, it's all about collaboration in my mind. None of us is in isolation. None of us is alone in this. We all must collaborate and move forward together. And that's why we continue to utilize West Bank through a RFP process, which identified around 14 developers that we looked at different attributes and a number of criteria through Ernst & Young, as I mentioned earlier, to help us develop proper processes on how do we wish to move forward and develop some of our lands. We own a lot of land, and there's not one developer that can do it all with us. So therefore, we have many different pokers in the fire.
So what role then?
I'm sorry, sir. I'm just going to get you to respond to this part, and we're going to go on to other questions. You can follow up with people afterwards.
Yeah, I think to Allison, to your question about how can we decolonize the city plan and get excited about city plan, the first city plan was drafted by good old Harlan Bartholomew. He was an avowed segregationist, and then while his plan didn't get fully implemented, he was an architect of something we still live with today. And as people are rushing to get their kids to school or trying to survive in the downtown east side and struggling with the impacts and ravages of mental health and addictions and, just trying to keep their nose above water, a city plan that kind of focuses on the same voices and the same minds all the time, of course, is going to be found to be exclusive and boring to people who don't see themselves represented. So if you have community developers like the people that are on the stage and the people that are in community and working very hard to develop community, if those folks can get a little bit more delegation of power and delegation of leadership, not just to be at the table, but to set the table, to set the conversation and to bring those ideas forward, I think you might see a little bit more excitement around something that otherwise folks feel is for academics and for professionals, or those who are very comfortably housed. And the other question about the role of neighborhoods in city plan, I think if we don't look at that equitably, we're going to continue to see the same kind of spatial segregation and exclusion that we have right now. Some neighborhoods have more power than others, right? The downtown east side and the nonprofit community in our city is constantly looking at how to use their assets to make more housing for folks. There's a lot of people who don't feel that way. They don't feel like we need to make space for other neighbors in their communities. So those are some barriers, and I think the answer really is in community developers.
Sarah, Ray, did either of you want to comment on those questions?
Yeah. You had a question for you, I think. Am I right?
What role does the neighborhood have?
Yeah.
Well, the neighborhood's both physical and social and environmental, and your friends and my friends and their friends. And we're all in it together. And if we're not careful, we start accusing the other ones of being impossible to deal with. And yet we're all here. We've all grown up through various processes of behavior in our neighborhoods. And so sometimes we're energetic in doing a piece of art in our neighborhood. Sometimes it's the neighbors are a nuisance. Sometimes anything can happen, but all of us need to work together. And so there's an attitudinal thing at all levels, not just at the people who feel they're not involved, but also the people who are involved. And my criticism has been about the people who appear to be involved at City Hall aren't reaching out enough. And these days that's complicated because there's so many ways to reach out. They're busy trying to find the way to do it. But in the meantime, there's a human being there, like you and I, who can say, hey, this is what we're doing. And what I'm saying, we need a little bit more of an attitude about saying, this is what we're doing, what do you think? And there's something different from going out and saying, what do you think? We all think a lot of stuff, but one of the things the bureaucracy has, you're part of that bureaucracy too, is that you have a lot of people who can do a lot of things that individually we can't do. So get them to look at the things we're interested in and tell us what they're finding. And that's a daily thing. I mean, surely all those people at City Hall must be finding very exciting things as they're looking at Citywide Plan right now. What are those exciting things that are happening? And how do we involve the neighborhoods? We tell the neighborhoods. We involve the neighborhoods. Now, the city plan people are already going out talking to neighborhoods, as you may know. They're talking to organizations and neighborhoods, and anybody who wants to talk to them, you should call them and ask to hear from them. But I'm saying you should call them, but they should also reach out and say, hey, this is what we're doing, isn't it fun? And this is what we did last month, and this is what we're doing next month.
Sarah?
Yeah, I mean, when, I find that, when you're planning a city, you get a lot of the same people coming out and making sure that, people who are in the downtown east side, for example, who, are busy with just, dealing with the terrible things that are happening of the day, or, maybe some good things that happen the day. But a lot of people just don't have the time to get involved with these things. So it's really important to make sure that, the voices that you don't necessarily are harder to hear get heard as well, including young people. A lot of times, I always had the most fun when I was able to see people who didn't necessarily come out to meetings, to the park board, to be able to share their voice and share what they like to do. And it's a little bit harder work for city council to do that, but it's so important in planning the city to get voices from everybody, across the city, even the busiest people and folks that don't have much to say usually, have a lot to say, or I don't know if that makes any sense, but.
Great. We'll go out to 3 more questions, and we'll come back to the panelists. I don't know if there's questions out there. Yeah. There's someone bringing you a microphone here.
Mary Ellen Belfiore. I'm just wondering how effective you think the mid-income pilot program that the city has put out. I think maybe there are 21 pilots. I think I'm not quite certain about the number. But with the 20% $30,000 to $80,000 middle income rental units. So where do you think that would take us, and how effective do you think it would be?
Great. Thank you for the question. We got time for 2 more on this round. Go ahead, Richard. 1 here and 1 there.
I'm Richard Campbell, and this is a question for Chief Campbell. So people have been talking about the city plan, or maybe even take a larger regional plan or over your territory. I'm wondering, how would you go about planning process, and what would you like to see as an outcome? I find myself inspired by the work you and the others are doing, and just like to see your perspective on that.
Great. And 1 more question there.
My name is Shula Leonard. I work with All On Board, which is a transit justice advocacy group, trying to get free transit for youth to age 18 and a low-income-based transit pass, like they have in Calgary. Believe me, there are lots of places in the world where this kind of stuff happens. But it's not happening here. And I love to see improved infrastructure, definitely. But all kinds of people are being left at the curb now. And for all the things that can be built, they're going to be left at the curb later, too. Because they are the kind of people who are in poverty or working poor. They don't come to meetings because they don't have time at all. So they don't get heard. Yes, I haven't thought of a brilliant way to involve people. I haven't. However, it concerns me that they'll still be left at the curb. In my neighborhood, East Van, I've seen some Parks Board, they have great mapping now about how much, there's just practically no parkland in East Vancouver, South Vancouver. There are places where there's hardly any. I'd love to know the history of how that happened, how somehow it all ended up other places, but not over there. I'm seeing all this development on Broadway, et cetera, and on all the arterials. But in the greening plan, I don't see developers having to put green roofs on those buildings 4 stories and higher. Where is there going to, that mitigates so many things, climate issues, health issues for people living within 150 meters of any arterial, many, many things. I just think, okay, if we're going to cover it all with concrete, can we please grow something up here to mitigate many things? I have gone to many open houses.
I'm going to ask you if you could get to a question, please.
Yeah, that is the question. How do you get people who don't have a voice to have a voice? And how, I hope How do we address new infrastructure, new all kinds of stuff, and hardly any affordable housing in any of it anyhow?
Great.
How?
Thank you. If any of you wanted to respond to any of those questions.
On the last question, several years ago, there was a committee set up in the downtown east side, which was deliberately framed to consist of a whole variety, everybody you could think of who lives in the downtown east side was given an opportunity to get on the committee. It was a large committee. I was co-chair for 5 years there on the committee, and everybody there had a voice. And we worked like you wouldn't believe in order to get the plan done. And in one sense, the cooperation between the city and the committee was not good, because the city kept changing the rules and the timetable and cutting back on the time we had to do our work. And so at the end, it ended up in a bit of a confrontation where the plan that the citizens had put together had been so altered. There was compromises, and maybe it was a reasonable compromise. I don't know. I didn't feel that way at the time. But the other thing that's so important there is that those people, having worked on that, then found that what they said got put in a plan, and then somebody went off and did something else on it. And so the other claim I think, a claim I make about all this planning effort is planning has to be continuous. We don't have a plan that we set today and then follow it laboriously for another 20 years before we do another one. We do a plan today, and we have to do a plan tomorrow if something happened today or tomorrow that affects the change. So we need another radical shift in what is planning. To produce a citywide plan of 400 pages that nobody really can read or understand is not going to do the trick. Hopefully they will find that the way to do the trick is to have statements at various levels of understanding that says, this is the way the plan is developing, this is what we're doing, in the language that all sorts of people can understand. And if they do that, and also have a continuous, some method, I haven't invented the method yet, of being able to keep everybody who's interested involved with, how do we go along now? They said that, this is the circumstance. So at any one moment you know where the plan is and what the plan is, but it does change regularly. We have to get used to the idea that planning isn't something you do every 5 years, it's planning that's done all the time.
Yeah, I'll go back to the question. Thank you. So, in my opinion, some of the planning processes that have been effective for us have been land use planning. It's been more on the macro 30,000 foot level. But in 2003, we did our Úxwumixw land use plan, mostly in the northern part of our territory, where we protected 8% of our territory under what we call I won't ask you to pronounce that, but basically it's a conservancy. So 8% of our territory protected in conservancies with co-management plans, 92% of the territory open to business in one way or another, as long as it meets our metrics. We then have to remove the ambiguity. What are our metrics? What are the values and principles? It means we must structure. So marine use planning was important to look at how sound, the connection to the Salish Sea, in the advent of increased shipping and industrial activity. What does that mean to the orcas? So it wasn't just adhering to Western science, but it was Western science paired with Indigenous science. So we did our own environmental assessments, issued our own conditions to really create stronger projects. There's resistance to that from certain levels of government and from business. But once we start to demonstrate tangible results, there's value. There's value propositions, value chains, there's economy. So it's really looking after that triple bottom line of economic, social, and environmental interests. I also look to New Zealand as a great example with the Maoris and how they're fully integrated through treaty, through economics, and through their values, through language, through identity. The Maoris are synonymous with New Zealand. We need to celebrate that same type of sentiment here in Vancouver. As I mentioned in my intro, it's laden with mythology. There's so much history and place names here that span thousands of years. Not that we came from some place called Mongolia. That's not our story. Our story talks about the ice ages, well, the great floods, the ice ages, pre-ice ages when there's megafauna, all the way back to our first ancestors. We need to celebrate things like the twin sisters. they're not lions. They're twin sisters that were transformed and immortalized to remind all of us to live amicably with each other. These stories are stories of humanity, stories of perseverance and transformation. If we celebrate those stories as much as we celebrate other cultures from around the world, we'll realize how rich we are here, that these are our stories. This is your stories, and we want you to celebrate that. So there's many ways that we can delve more micro or macro in answering that question. But certainly planning processes, restructuring our governments as Indigenous people away from the Indian Act is what we're actively doing by redefining the roles and responsibilities of our governance and our economic arms, limited liability, partnerships, all of those types of economic reconciliation is going to be important to lift each other up away from poverty. That is a burden on Canadian taxpayers when we continue to live with poverty and child apprehensions and incarceration. That's not the society we want to live in. That's not the future of my children or grandchildren. We could do better. They deserve better. And it means planning processes. I know that's pretty overly simplistic, but I hope that helps.
I think that, planners should be embedded in communities. So, yeah, I think, yeah, embedded. Yeah, they should be in the communities, understanding what people want and then reflecting that. If you give people something to come out for, they will come out, right? If you know your community well enough, they'll tell you what they need, and then you can start to build on that. All these things should be coming from community members. I know exactly within my community that I'm working in right now, I would know how to approach that community, and they would come out and they would tell me what they need. And I get told what they need every day. So I think, and so I think it's really important to, you see sometimes the city's over here, and then they're making the plans and on office, and then the community's doing something completely different. So, for the bus thing, when you talked about the kids getting on the bus, my son can't have a Compass card. He loses it every day. He never has any change. If he has change, he buys himself a chocolate bar, and then he's stuck somewhere. So, I mean, and then no one can afford, a bus fare for kids.
He's watching online right now and going, Mom!
No, I know. No, he's not. I know what he's doing, but he's not doing that. He's 16. He doesn't, he ends up walking, which is probably good for him anyways, but... it's problematic, and he tries to sneak on I know he's sneaking on the SkyTrain because I saw a ticket in his room not too long ago. So, which makes young people doing illegal things is never a good thing, right? Sneaking on things and whatever else. So young people, it would be a nice burden to get rid of, to have to think that my son and all the other young guys and kids could get on the thing and not worry about it. He's not making any money to get on the bus. So anyways, whatever. But I think mostly everybody understands that.
I got a ticket once. I think bravo to you for this work on transit. It's a justice issue, right? Low-income people are excluded, and yet they're the ones traveling into our cities to take jobs that they can't afford to live in the city for. So I think it's a critical part of this conversation is looking at how to make transit without a cost to the individual. Of course, there's a cost to it, but why aren't we bearing that cost like we do for roads? Those are provided for free. To the low-income housing pile or the middle-income housing pile, I think it was a great move in the right direction to stimulate developers to think about rental housing and to think about moving in that direction. For so long, the city, the most lucrative housing is to build condominiums and to get in and get out and make your money. And so things that can stimulate and move policy in the direction of enticing developers into building rental housing is important. Other cities in this country have rental housing supply. It booms, it busts. Sometimes the rents are high, sometimes they're low. There's vacancy. We really struggle in this city. And if we don't have a supply, we're going to continue to see the types of incredibly outrageous rental rates and vacancy rates that we have. To the part about bringing voices to the table that aren't there, or how to give people a voice, I just think it's important for all of us in our work to recognize that people have a voice. What they don't have is a mic. So let's pass the mic, where we can. Thank you. And we have to think about when we set up these types of engagement. The best time to get people to vote, to register to vote, Black voters in the States, was after church. They used to have a bus and everybody would get on and they'd take everybody to register to vote. So let's meet people where they are. Like maybe that's Sunday afternoon, maybe it's Saturday afternoon with childcare. And the other thing I think I've learned about bringing voices to the table is you have to establish trust with people. I've been going down to Oppenheimer Park since August to hear back from the people there about how our decisions and our processes have impacted them around housing at BC Housing. And doing so, I got yelled at, I got cussed out. I represent a big bureaucracy that has an impact on people's lives, but I didn't shatter into too many pieces. And I was able to, at least build a sense of rapport and trust with folks. So now I can sit at tables and talk real solutions and real problem solving and be really honest about what we can and can't do, but now there's at least that rapport that we've established, right? So, park spaces and clean air, that's a justice issue. A lot of people live in this city with access to those things, and a lot of people don't. And so we've got to look at how park spaces are themselves a matter of justice and bringing people to spaces where they have greenery. And we've got to look at this massive single-family housing that has there's a great park near my neighborhood, where I live, that's never in use because all the homes around it are pretty used part of the year, and there's no families anymore, and it's just near Granville and 16th. Like there's not a lot of people around there anymore. So how are people getting to those spaces? Well, they can't. They're not even welcome in those communities to live. So a few things there, I guess, about the question. Yeah.
Great. We've got time for 2 more questions. So there's 2 right there.
Hi, my name's Dave. I wonder, just with the talk of the city plan, if anybody on stage feels my anxiety about, it's not a zero stakes game, city plan, right? We have to find a way to accommodate a million people here, and and provide a massive amount of supply, which means housing density, and that's often ended badly for directors of planning and councils when they've tried to do this in specifically West Side neighborhoods, but in many neighborhoods around the city. And is anybody worried that this is such a high stakes game that it's kind of set up to fail in terms of the enormity of the task and to put it into one document and to address all the need for a plural and just conversation about it? I don't know. I want to know that I'm not alone, I guess, in my anxiety. So I'm wondering if you feel the same anxiety about it, and if there are ideas about how we can address that.
We'll take that one more question and we'll come back. But it is always good to democratize your anxiety by sharing it with others. Go ahead with your question.
My name is Jens, and I have a question primarily for Chief Campbell, but really for the whole panel. So I've heard a lot of opinions about the Snork development from a lot of different people. But if nothing else, Snork is also, it's a statement that that sends a message to the city. It feels like it has an opinion about planning in the city. So I would like to know, what message does the Snork development send to the city of Vancouver?
All right, thank you. I'm actually going to let Chief Ian Campbell go first because you have to go to a family event that I'm committed to getting to you on time. So I'll let you, and I'll have a final comment as well as you.
I appreciate that. Thank you. No, I really value this time. Thank you all for your amazing questions. And I share your anxiety, absolutely. I like to climb mountains. And how do you climb a mountain? One step at a time, right? We want to solve all issues all at once. And when the MST nations came together, our protocol agreement was very narrow in scope. It was simply about dispositions of lands that are claimed by the Crown within our territories. We're not going to solve the ports or gaming or fisheries or all the other myriad of issues between us. We had to focus. By doing that, we demonstrated immediate tangible results that were substantive with land acquisitions, future opportunities, value chains, solutions to be a part of the fabric. But that anxiety still remains for me because it's an ongoing concern. It never stops. These are going to be lease lands for 99 years or whatever to be determined. You're seeing iterations and renderings, but that's not the final product. Those are just someone's fantasy, someone's dream of what's possible. The real action is taking the first step to climb that mountain, to be prepared, to have the right tools, to have backup plans. It's the planning process, which goes back to a previous question, that really makes the difference for us to have, of course, a vision, but then map it out. It has to be pragmatic, has to be tangible. And we're not going to get it right every time. We're going to make mistakes. And part of that is part of the growing and the learning and doing better, the striving to improve. We also can't be afraid of feedback. So when this goes to the second question, when it comes to Snork or any other development that the nation's involved in, we get volumes of feedback. And it is great because we welcome feedback. If you look at the Burrard Street Bridge is in trespass on our village. We don't raise a big deal about that, but it is a negotiating point with the city that we're going to have to sit down face to face and talk about. When we put the digital signboards up, you should see the emails we received. They said we're going to blot the sun out. People are like, how dare you Indians go and put up signboards, and ruin my viewscape? And I'm like, reality check. Look around you. There's a sea of development. And just because we're entering the market doesn't mean we're going to replicate Western practices in the way that we approach things. We're going to be innovative. We're not capsuled in time in a museum behind glass where tradition is 200 years ago. Tradition is today. What we do today will someday be traditional. So it's that continuity of tradition to apply traditional knowledge in a modern context. I go hunting, I use a gun. I don't use a bow and arrow. It doesn't mean I'm any less Squamish because I utilize a modern tool. When Robert Davidson was carving his pole down in False Creek, he was using a chainsaw to shape his pole. Tourists came by and said, that's not a traditional Haida pole. Your ancestors never used chainsaws. He said, well, they would have if they had them. So we're not isolated from the rest of society where, we're not going to utilize the best tools available to us. And that doesn't mean we're just going to build everything to maximum capacity. We want to do it right, and we want to be a part of the solution. So Snork is a part of that solution. We're not in isolation. It's not an island. It's not a city-state. It's a part of a contemporary dynamic that we fought for. We fought for justice to get those lands back in 2003. And the reclamation ceremony, when we brought in canoes and landed on those shores, it was the first time our people did that in generations, because it was illegal for us to practice our culture under Canadian law prior to the 1950s. If we wore our regalia, did our ceremonies, the RCMP, just like they're doing in Wet'suwet'en today, would come in and they would confiscate and arrest us and criminalize us. But we're not afraid. We can't be afraid to be bold and to take action and to receive feedback. Feedback could be negative. It's rhetoric. You can't go outside and roll around in the mud over it. It might be positive and constructive where it's something we missed. We should pay attention to that. Or it might reaffirm our vision and draw people in. So we have to pay attention to feedback. It's all valuable.
Thank you so much, Chief Ian Campbell.
Thank you, everybody. If I may, I would like to step up. Thank you. I do appreciate it. Heichka.
Ray, I'm going to get you to go next for any comments.
Can I go?
Thank you very much.
Can I go?
Yeah, go ahead.
Please. I'm with him. It's anxiety driving to think of a whole citywide plan and how that's going to go over at the end of the day. Even developing one park. When we developed Oppenheimer, there was a lot of people who were really upset. They were upset that we were redeveloping Oppenheimer and that we were doing it for all the wrong reasons. And why were we not doing that in the West Side and all kinds of different things. So it's a very stressful thing to do all the way across the city. And I think the councillors are all working together nicely right now. But it's when things start to get a bit stressful, it's going to be interesting to see how if they can stay together and really work on a plan that really works for the benefit of the people, that won't make every single person happy in the city. I think there's a lot of benefits to having a plan moving forward, so that people know, have something to refer to know how we're moving forward, and it can be done in a fair way where people feel like across the city, no matter what place you're in, that you're not being prioritized in one way or another. So I think there's a lot of really good benefits to the citywide plan. It's going to take Councillor Fry having to get up there and sell that citywide plan, and there's going to be a lot of unhappy people. And at the end of the day, when some of the things that are part of the citywide plan come to fruition, people will see that there's a lot of benefits to planning for the future and actually implementing a lot of things, and putting funding towards goals. So I think. It'll be a tough time, but I hope that that the councillors can work together really, and not play silly bugger, but you know what I mean. Just in terms of just politicizing parts of it, just for the sake of hopefully election time won't be happening at that point, but and then ultimately people will be doing that sort of thing. But yeah, it's important for solidarity. For the citizens of Vancouver, they deserve solidarity on something like that, and working for the people, so.
Yeah, and I think for this, I share some of your anxiety. I don't know if I have as much of it, but it is an enormous task, and it's not something I think, as a comment we heard tonight from my panelist here, that it's not something you just do once and then we're done forever. It is iterative and it's ongoing, and that's the thing about best practices. Best practices today are going to be a completely different thing in a year. We continue to evolve our wisdom, and there's an African proverb that says, if you want to go fast, go alone, and if you want to go far, go together. And I think if we don't slow down and make sure that we're including all voices, I think that's when this thing is at its largest risk.
Thank you. Ray.
On the question of complexity, it occurs to me that the best way to deal with it is to be honest about it. So that's the first deal that's difficult, because politicians frequently can't be, because they're supposed to be successful, so everything becomes successful that they've decided. But the other people, that's the community or the people in charge of looking at the planning, can take a different attitude, which is, here is our idea, and it has those problems and those opportunities. And as the plan goes on, they all change. And nobody blames them because there's change. They thank them because they were identified, so that when they occurred and people could see them, they could do something about them. And so it will always be complicated. It's never going to be free and easy and straightforward. But if we acknowledge the complexity, acknowledge the fact that I don't know sometimes, and that's okay, because we don't know either. It's sort of comparing the what is known with the what isn't known and being honest about it. And that's difficult to do planning like that, because somebody's going to make a decision that says, we've just produced the best plan you've ever seen in your life. Which is going to happen with this one, I suspect, although we will be more skeptical about it after this meeting.
I just wanted to say thank you so much to the panelists. Given how politics are playing out in other parts of the world, listening to the State of the Union address, where politics have gone in all sorts of things, that we can actually talk through different types of difference here in the city, and to do that together is really important. And I really treasure that part of the city, to have these forums, and the role of Vancouver City Planning Commission and other committees in the city do as well. And so thank you so much to the panelists. I wanted to invite up Robert Matus, who's really led the charge on this part of the work of the Planning Commission timeline. So please welcome Robert.
I was really taken with the remarks that you made. We listened to the State of the Union. It was a bit of a State of the City we heard tonight, covering a lot of different aspects. Certainly the crisis that was mentioned, that there's a lot of work to be done there. The more focus in the Hogan Valley, and there was a lot of focus on something the Planning Commission has talked about a lot, City for All, and the inclusiveness, which will something that has to be figured out for the Vancouver plan. I think that what it actually said about the milestones in 2019, I guess, is that last year was maybe a baby steps that we're taking towards some big actions that are coming down the road. That wasn't something that the city changed dramatically last year, but maybe hold on to your seat. Things are going to change in Vancouver soon. So we want to thank you for that insight very much, and we have some things here to and ready.
Thank you.
I mixed up, please. Sorry. I think I got it right there. I also want to note that the chronology is very much a collaborative effort. I think since the Planning Commission started working on this 5 or 6 years ago, literally hundreds of people in Vancouver have showed up for our discussions and participated in what some other people might think is rather esoteric topics. But there's been incredible enthusiasm to delve into these issues. I want to thank our partners here, the SFU Community Engagement Office, for the support they've given us, and also the volunteers on the committee, which I'd like to mention. There's Karen Krangle, there's Marta Fairbank, Elizabeth Ballantyne, Grant Duckworth. I don't see where Grant is. He's back there. Yijin Wen, Leslie Shi, and Jessica Yang haven't been able to show up here. They were also involved. And Frankie Mao, who's somewhere in the dark there, he was the coordinator for this event. And Yuri Arteva, our executive director. And I especially want to thank the audience for coming out this evening for this discussion on city building. I think if you enjoyed tonight, you had fun, and you'd like to do this again, then you should speak to some of the committee members and join us. It's a year-round activity, city building. Thank you again. Good night.
Can I do one thing before we go? That's a little fun. Okay, sorry, I know you're about to leave. It's Black History Month, as you know, and I want to teach you one word, and Amina, help me. Ubuntu is from what dialect? So it's from southern Swahili area. So I want to teach you one, and I want you to say it with me. It's Ubuntu. And it means with one mind. So I send you forward with that wish that we work with one mind moving together forward. Thank you.